The radio crackle was static before the voice came through, cold and final. "Viper team, this is command. You are ordered to abort mission and return to base immediately. Acknowledge." Captain Marcus Steele looked at the device in his hand, then at the 15 men who had followed him through hell for the past 6 months. They were less than 2 kilometers from the terrorist compound that intelligence had been tracking for over a year, the headquarters of the cell responsible for bombing 3 American embassies and killing hundreds of innocent civilians. In 6 hours, the compound's leadership would scatter to safe houses across the region, disappearing for months or years until they could regroup and strike again. "Command, this is Viper Actual," Steele replied, his voice steady. "We are in position to complete the mission. Request permission to proceed." The response was immediate and non-negotiable. "Negative, Viper Actual. Mission parameters have changed. RTB immediately." Steele looked at his men, saw the same determination in their eyes that had carried them through impossible missions, and made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. He keyed the radio one final time. "Command, radio is breaking up. Unable to copy your last transmission. Welcome to those who left a trace." Before we dive into this incredible story of courage, brotherhood, and the moment when 15 soldiers chose justice over orders, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe that some missions are too important to abandon, regardless of what headquarters decides, hit that subscribe button. These stories remind us that true warriors fight not just for their country, but for the principles that make their sacrifice meaningful. The Hindu Kush mountains of eastern Afghanistan rose like ancient tombstones against the morning sky, their peaks shrouded in clouds that had witnessed centuries of conflict and conquest. Among these mountains, carved into a valley that appeared on no civilian maps, sat a compound that had become the nerve center for terrorist operations spanning 3 continents. For 18 months, coalition intelligence had been tracking the activities that flowed from this remote fortress, coordinating attacks, training operatives, and planning operations designed to maximize civilian casualties and global terror. Captain Marcus Steele had been studying this target for 6 months, ever since Viper Team had been assigned to the Joint Special Operations Command's most classified counterterrorism unit. Steele was 34 years old, a career soldier who had earned his commission through battlefield performance rather than military academy credentials. His men trusted him because he had never asked them to take risks he wouldn't take himself, never made decisions based on politics rather than tactical reality, and never abandoned a mission when lives were at stake. Viper Team consisted of 15 operators selected from the most elite units in the American military: Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon, and Air Force Pararescue Specialists who had been cross-trained in capabilities that made them individually lethal and collectively unstoppable. They had been operating together for 3 years, long enough to develop the kind of trust and coordination that allowed them to accomplish missions that larger forces couldn't attempt. The compound they were approaching had been designated Target Sigma 7, a facility that intelligence assessed as containing between 8 and 12 high-value targets whose elimination would disrupt terrorist networks across the Middle East and Central Asia. More importantly, the compound housed communication equipment and operational documents that could reveal the locations of sleeper cells in American and European cities, intelligence that could prevent attacks targeting thousands of innocent civilians. Steele's mission briefing had been clear: infiltrate the compound, eliminate or capture designated targets, secure intelligence materials, and extract without compromise. The operation had been planned for 4 months, with contingencies developed for every scenario except the one they now faced. Direct orders to abort when they were within hours of achieving complete tactical success. The reason for the abort order was political rather than tactical. Intelligence sources had revealed that the compound's leadership included individuals connected to regional governments that the State Department was attempting to negotiate with for broader counterterrorism cooperation. Eliminating these targets could jeopardize diplomatic initiatives that might produce long-term strategic benefits that exceeded the immediate tactical advantages of the mission. But Steele and his men understood something that diplomats and policymakers couldn't grasp from their offices in Washington. the cost of allowing this compound to remain operational. They had spent months tracking the intelligence that flowed from this facility, watching as attack plans were developed and executed, seeing the aftermath of bombings that could have been prevented if Target Sigma-7 had been eliminated when they first identified its location. The decision to disobey direct orders was not made lightly or individually. Steele gathered his team leaders, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, the communications specialist who had been with him since their first deployment, Master Sergeant Kim, the demolitions expert whose technical skills had saved their lives in 3 separate operations, and Staff Sergeant Washington, the sniper whose precision had enabled missions that would have been impossible without his capabilities. "Command wants us to abort," Steele told them, his voice carrying the weight of decision that would affect all their careers and possibly their lives. "Intelligence says that eliminating these targets could complicate diplomatic negotiations that might produce better long-term results than tactical success." Rodriguez looked toward the compound, visible through the pre-dawn darkness as a collection of lights that represented months of planning and preparation. "And how many people die while we're waiting for diplomacy to work?" Kim checked his equipment, ensuring that the charges he had prepared for the mission were still properly configured. "We've been tracking intelligence from that facility for 6 months. Every week we delay, more attacks get planned and executed." Washington adjusted his scope, studying the compound's defensive positions with a methodical attention that had made him one of the most effective snipers in special operations. "The targets will scatter in 6 hours. We won't get another opportunity like this for months, maybe years." Steele understood that his team leaders were expressing not just tactical assessments, but moral judgments about the cost of following orders that prioritized political considerations over operational effectiveness. These were soldiers who had volunteered for the most dangerous missions their military could assign, who had accepted risks that most people couldn't comprehend, and who had made sacrifices that would never be fully recognized or rewarded. "If we proceed with the mission," Steele said, "we're disobeying direct orders from Joint Command. Our careers are finished, and we could face court-martial proceedings that end with prison sentences." Rodriguez nodded understanding. "And if we abort, how many innocent people die in attacks that we could have prevented today?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswered because it was unanswerable. They could follow orders and preserve their careers while knowing that their decision might cost hundreds or thousands of innocent lives. Or they could complete the mission and accept personal consequences that could destroy their futures while saving lives they would never meet and preventing attacks they would never be credited with stopping. Steele looked at each of his team leaders, seeing in their faces the same calculation he was making. That some decisions couldn't be measured by personal cost, that some missions were too important to abandon for bureaucratic convenience, and that true leadership sometimes require accepting responsibility for outcomes that others wouldn't risk their careers to achieve. "All right," Steele said, "we proceed with the mission. But everyone needs to understand, once we cross that line, there's no going back. We're committed until completion, regardless of consequences." The final approach to Target Sigma-7 required movement through terrain that had been designed by nature to prevent exactly the kind of infiltration Viper Team was attempting. The compound sat in a valley surrounded by ridgelines that provided excellent observation and fields of fire for defensive forces, while approach routes were limited to narrow passages that could be easily monitored and controlled by relatively small numbers of guards. Steele had planned their infiltration route to minimize exposure while maximizing their tactical advantages once they reached the compound perimeter. The team would move in 3 elements. Rodriguez would lead the assault team that would penetrate the compound's main buildings. Kim would position his demolitions team to prevent reinforcement and secure escape routes, and Washington would establish overwatch positions that could provide precision fire support throughout the operation. The movement to their assault positions took 4 hours, conducted in complete silence through terrain that challenged even their exceptional training and conditioning. Each operator carried approximately 80 pounds of equipment, including weapons, ammunition, communications gear, demolitions, medical supplies, and specialized equipment needed for their specific roles in the mission. At 0347 hours, they reached the compound perimeter and began the final reconnaissance that would determine the exact timing and coordination of their assault. Through night vision equipment, they could observe guard positions, identify approach routes to their primary objectives, and confirm intelligence about the compound's layout and defensive preparations. The facility was larger than satellite imagery had suggested, with additional buildings that had been constructed since their last intelligence update. More concerning, defensive positions showed evidence of recent improvement, with fighting positions that suggested the compound security force was larger and better trained than previous assessments had indicated. "Command! This is Viper Actual," Steele whispered into his radio, attempting one final coordination with headquarters before beginning the assault. "We are in position and ready to commence mission. Request final authorization to proceed." The response came immediately, carrying a tone that left no room for misunderstanding. "Viper Actual, you are ordered to abort mission immediately. Do not engage. Acknowledge and begin immediate extraction." Steele looked at Rodriguez, Kim, and Washington, seeing in their faces the same resolve that had brought them to this moment. They had traveled thousands of miles, trained for months, and risked their lives to reach this position. The targets they had been assigned to eliminate were less than 200 meters away, and they had tactical advantages that would never be replicated once this opportunity was lost. "Command," Steele replied, "we are proceeding with mission as briefed. Viper Actual out." He switched off his radio, understanding that the next communication from headquarters would probably be orders for his immediate arrest and court-martial. But the decision had been made, not just by him, but by 15 operators who had volunteered for missions that tested the limits of human capability and who understood that some responsibilities transcended career considerations. "All stations, this is Viper Actual," Steele announced over the team communications network. "We are green for assault. Execute on my mark." The assault on target Sigma 7 began at 0412 hours with coordinated explosions that eliminated the compound's external communications and power systems, plunging the facility into darkness while preventing the defenders from calling for reinforcement. Kim's demolitions team had positioned charges with precision that disabled critical systems, without creating the kind of large explosions that would alert hostile forces throughout the region. Rodriguez led the primary assault team to the compound's main entrance, using breaching charges and coordinated movement to penetrate defensive positions that had been designed to prevent exactly this type of infiltration. The assault team moved with rehearsed precision through buildings and corridors that intelligence had mapped, but which proved more complex and better defended than their briefings had suggested. Washington's sniper team provided overwatch from positions that dominated the compound's approaches and internal areas, their precision fire eliminating specific threats that could have compromised the assault while avoiding collateral damage that could harm intelligence materials they were assigned to secure. The initial resistance was lighter than expected, suggesting that the compound's defensive force had been caught off guard by the speed and coordination of the assault. But Steele understood that this advantage was temporary. Once the defenders recovered from their initial surprise, they would coordinate more effective resistance using defensive positions and superior knowledge of the facility's layout. Building 1 secure, Rodriguez reported over the communications network. 3 high-value targets neutralized, intelligence materials being secured. Building 2 in progress. Kim's voice carried the controlled urgency that marked urban combat operations. Heavy resistance on the second floor, but we're making progress. Washington's reports were more sporadic, but indicated successful neutralization of threats that could have prevented the assault team from achieving their objectives. Sniper eliminated. Assault team has clear approach to building 3. The coordination was flawless, the result of 3 years of training and operations that had taught them to function as a unit whose capabilities exceeded the sum of their individual skills. But Steele understood that their tactical success was creating strategic complications that would follow them long after the mission was complete. By 0534 hours, Viper team had achieved their primary objectives: elimination of 8 high-value targets, capture of intelligence materials that revealed operational plans spanning multiple continents, and destruction of communication equipment that had coordinated terrorist activities across the region. The compound defensive force had been neutralized or scattered, and the facility itself had been rendered inoperative for any future terrorist activities. But Steele's radio, which he had switched back on to monitor communications, was receiving messages that indicated their unauthorized mission was creating exactly the kind of political complications that headquarters had attempted to prevent by ordering the abort. All stations. This is Joint Command. The voice was different from their normal communications, carrying authority that suggested general officer level attention to their situation. Viper Team is ordered to cease all offensive operations immediately. You are in violation of direct orders and are subject to immediate disciplinary action. Acknowledge and prepare for extraction. Steele understood that acknowledging this transmission would require him to explain their decision to proceed with the mission despite direct orders to abort. But the same calculation that had led him to disobey the abort order now suggested that further communication with headquarters would serve no tactical purpose and might compromise their ability to complete secondary objectives that could prevent future terrorist attacks. Viper Team maintained communication silence. Steele ordered over their internal network. Continue mission as planned. Rodriguez had secured intelligence documents that revealed the locations of terrorist cells in 6 American cities. Information that could prevent attacks targeting shopping centers, schools, and transportation hubs where thousands of civilians could be killed or wounded. Kim's demolitions team had discovered chemical weapons stored in quantities that suggested preparations for attacks using agents that would cause mass casualties and long-term contamination of populated areas. Washington's Overwatch positions had identified additional compounds in the surrounding mountains, facilities that appeared to be training centers for operatives whose missions would take them to targets in the United States and Europe. These discoveries exceeded the intelligence that had justified their original mission, but they also revealed the scope of terrorist activities that made their unauthorized actions seem not just justified, but essential. Command, this is Viper Actual, Steele finally responded to the increasingly urgent messages from headquarters. We have secured intelligence indicating imminent attacks on civilian targets in major American cities. Request immediate analysis and distribution to appropriate agencies. The response was immediate and uncompromising. Viper Actual, you're ordered to cease all operations and prepare for immediate extraction. Intelligence materials will be processed through appropriate channels after your return to base. Steele looked at the documents Rodriguez had secured, reading operational plans that described attack schedule for the following week against targets that included elementary schools, shopping malls, and subway systems. The attacks were designed to maximize civilian casualties and create the kind of terror that would dominate news coverage for months while paralyzing normal life in affected cities. Negative, Command, Steele replied. Intelligence indicates attacks planned for next week against civilian targets. Immediate distribution required to prevent mass casualties. Viper Actual, you're relieved of command. Prepare your team for immediate extraction and disciplinary action. Steele switched off his radio again, understanding that further communication with headquarters would only create additional complications without serving any tactical purpose. His team had achieved their primary objectives, secured intelligence that could save thousands of lives, and eliminated a terrorist command structure that had been responsible for coordinating attacks across multiple continents. But their success had been achieved through disobedience of direct orders, violation of engagement protocols, and unauthorized action that could compromise diplomatic initiatives that their civilian leadership considered more important than immediate tactical victories. The consequences of their decision would follow them regardless of how many lives their actions might save or how many attacks their intelligence might prevent. All stations, this is Viper Actual, Steele announced over the team communications network. Primary mission complete. Begin secondary sweep for additional intelligence and prepare for extraction on my command. What Steele didn't communicate to his team was his understanding that their extraction would likely involve arrest, court-martial proceedings, and imprisonment for actions that had violated fundamental principles of military discipline and civilian control of military operations. But the same principles that had led him to disobey the abort order now suggested that protecting his team from the consequences of his decisions was more important than preserving his own career or freedom. The secondary sweep of Target Sigma. 7 revealed intelligence that exceeded even their most optimistic expectations for mission success. Hidden facilities contained documents describing a coordinated series of attacks planned for major American and European cities. Weapons caches that included chemical and biological agents intended for use against civilian populations, and communication logs that revealed the identities and locations of operatives who had already been deployed to target locations. That Rodriguez's team discovered operational plans that described attacks against water treatment facilities designed to contaminate drinking water for entire metropolitan areas. Kim's demolition specialist found laboratory equipment and chemical agents that could produce weapons capable of causing mass casualties and long-term health effects among exposed populations. Washington's Overwatch team identified training facilities where operatives were being prepared for suicide attacks against targets that included hospitals, schools, and religious institutions. The scope of the terrorist network that operated from Target Sigma 7 was far larger than intelligence assessments had suggested, with tentacles that reached into countries and regions that had been considered secure from this type of threat. The elimination of the compound's leadership and the capture of its intelligence materials would disrupt operations that could have killed tens of thousands of innocent civilians and cause social and economic damage that would require years to recover from. But Steele understood that the strategic value of their unauthorized mission would be overshadowed by the political complications created by their decision to disobey direct orders. The intelligence they had secured would be processed through channels that prioritize political considerations over operational effectiveness, and the lives saved by their actions would never be counted against the careers destroyed by their violations of military discipline. Viper Actual, this is Joint Command. The radio message carried a tone that suggested final warning. You have 60 minutes to prepare your team for extraction. Failure to comply will result in additional charges and more severe disciplinary action. Steele looked at the intelligence materials his team had secured, understanding that 60 minutes was insufficient time to properly document and transmit information that could prevent attacks against civilian targets in multiple countries. The processing and distribution of this intelligence would require coordination between agencies whose bureaucratic procedures could delay critical information for days or weeks, while attacks were carried out against targets that could be protected if appropriate warnings were provided immediately. All stations, this is Viper Actual. Steele announced his team. We have 1 hour to complete intelligence processing and prepare for extraction. Priority is documentation and transmission of time-sensitive threat information. Rodriguez understood the implications of Steele's order. They would use their remaining time to ensure that the intelligence they had secured would reach agencies capable of preventing attacks, even if this effort further complicated their legal situation by extending their period of disobedience and unauthorized action. Kim's demolitions team worked to secure chemical and biological agents that pose immediate threat to civilian populations if they fell into the hands of other terrorist groups. The materials required specialized handling and disposal procedures that exceeded their field capabilities, but they could ensure that the agents were neutralized or secured until specialized teams could assume responsibility for proper disposal. Washington's sniper team maintained security while conducting final reconnaissance of surrounding areas that could contain additional facilities or operatives who might attempt to recover intelligence materials or continue operations from alternative locations. Their observations identified several sites that warranted further investigation by follow-on forces, but which were beyond the scope of their current mission. The coordination was methodical and professional, reflecting their understanding that this would likely be their final operation as a unit and possibly their final opportunity to contribute to counterterrorism operations that had defined their careers and their identities as soldiers. Each man worked with a focused intensity that came from knowing that their actions over the next hour could determine whether thousands of innocent people lived or died in attacks that were already being planned and coordinated. 15 minutes. Steele announced, watching the clock that measured both their remaining operational time and the final minutes of their military careers. Complete current tasks and prepare for extraction. At 0647 hours, exactly 60 minutes after Joint Command's final warning, 3 CH-47 Chinook helicopters appeared over the valley containing Target Sigma 7. The aircraft carried not just extraction capabilities, but military police units whose mission was to arrest the members of Viper Team and begin the legal proceedings that would end their military careers and possibly result in lengthy prison sentences. Steele watched the helicopters approach, understanding that their arrival marked the end of more than just their unauthorized mission. For 3 years, Viper Team had operated as one of the most effective counterterrorism units in the American military, conducting operations that had eliminated high-value targets, disrupted terrorist networks, and prevented attacks that would have killed thousands of innocent civilians. Their success had been built on trust, training, and the willingness to accept risks that most soldiers couldn't contemplate. But their effectiveness had also depended on operating within a military structure that provided legal authority, logistical support, and political cover for actions that were often morally justified but legally questionable. By choosing to disobey direct orders, Steele and his team had severed their connection to the institutional framework that had made their operations possible. They had preserved their ability to complete one final mission, but they had also destroyed their ability to continue the work that had defined their professional lives and their contributions to national security. All stations, this is Viper Actual, Steele announced over the team communications network. Extraction aircraft are on final approach. Secure all equipment and prepare for detention and transport. Rodriguez completed the final documentation of intelligence materials, ensuring that threat information would reach appropriate agencies regardless of what happened to the operators who had secured it. Kim finished neutralizing chemical and biological agents, reducing the immediate threat they posed while preserving samples that could be analyzed to develop countermeasures against similar weapons. Washington maintained overwatch until the extraction helicopters touched down, his precision rifle providing security for his teammates, even though he understood that their next destination would be military detention facilities rather than operational bases where they could plan future missions. The military police who emerged from helicopters were professional but firm, arresting each member of Viper Team with procedures that recognized both their elite training and their current status as soldiers who had violated fundamental principles of military discipline. Steele submitted to arrest without resistance, understanding that compliance with legal procedures was important for maintaining the dignity of his team and possibly reducing severity of charges they would face. Captain Steele, the military police commander, approached with handcuffs and legal documentation that would formally begin court-martial proceedings. You and your team are under arrest for disobedience of direct orders, violation of engagement protocols, and unauthorized military action. You have the right to remain silent and the right to legal representation. Steele nodded understanding, but before accepting the handcuffs, he handed the military police commander a sealed package containing intelligence documents that his team had secured during their unauthorized mission. This contains information about imminent attacks against civilian targets in American cities. Time-sensitive distribution is required to prevent mass casualties. The military police commander accepted the package but made no commitment about its processing or distribution. This material will be forwarded through appropriate channels. Steele understood that appropriate channels meant bureaucratic procedures that could delay critical intelligence while attacks were carried out against targets that could be protected if proper warnings were provided immediately. But he had done everything possible to ensure that the intelligence reached agencies capable of preventing attacks, and the rest was beyond his control or responsibility. As the helicopters lifted off, carrying Viper Team away from the compound where they had achieved their greatest tactical success and made the decisions that would end their military careers, Steele looked down at Target Sigma 7 one final time. The facility was burning, its communications equipment destroyed, its leadership eliminated, and its intelligence materials secured by American forces. In the month that followed, agencies would analyze the intelligence Viper Team had secured and would prevent attacks that would have killed thousands of innocent civilians in American and European cities. Chemical and biological weapons that could have caused mass casualties and long-term health effects would be neutralized by specialists who understood the threat they represented. Terrorist networks that had operated across multiple continents would be disrupted by coordinated operations that eliminated key personnel and infrastructure. But Steele and his team would experience none of the satisfaction that normally came from successful counterterrorism operations. They would spend the following months in military detention facilities, undergoing legal proceedings that would determine whether their actions constituted justified disobedience or criminal violation of military law. The court-martial proceedings for Captain Marcus Steele and the 14 members of Viper Team began 6 months after their arrest, conducted at Fort Bragg under security measures that prevented public attendance or media coverage. The charges were serious: willful disobedience of direct orders, violation of engagement protocols, unauthorized military action, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. But the case was complicated by evidence that emerged during the investigation period, intelligence that revealed the scope of terrorist activities that had been disrupted by their unauthorized mission. The chemical and biological weapons they had secured were analyzed and found to contain agents that could have killed tens of thousands of civilians if deployed against water treatment facilities or transportation hubs in major American cities. The operational plans they had captured described coordinated attacks against elementary schools, shopping centers, and hospitals that would have created casualty levels exceeding any previous terrorist attack against American civilian targets. The communication logs they had secured led to the identification and arrest of operatives who had already been deployed to target cities and were in final stages of preparation for attacks scheduled within weeks of Viper Team's unauthorized mission. Military prosecutors argued that Steele and his team had violated fundamental principles of civilian control over military operations, setting a precedent that could undermine the chain of command and lead to military units making independent decisions about when and where to use lethal force. The charges were serious and the evidence of disobedience was indisputable. Steele had received direct orders to abort the mission and had explicitly refused to comply. But the defense argument was equally compelling. Steele and his team had prevented attacks that would have killed thousands of innocent civilians, and the orders they had disobeyed were based on political considerations that prioritized diplomatic negotiations over the immediate protection of American lives. The intelligence they had secured through their unauthorized mission had enabled counterterrorism operations that had disrupted terrorist networks across multiple continents. The trial lasted 8 weeks, with testimony from intelligence officials who confirmed the strategic value of the mission, military commanders who emphasized the importance of obedience to orders, and counterterrorism specialists who described the attacks that had been prevented by Viper Team's actions. Steele testified on his own behalf, explaining the reasoning that had led him to disobey direct orders. "I understand that military effectiveness depends on obedience to orders and respect for the chain of command. But I also understand that our oath is to support and defend the Constitution, which includes protecting American citizens from enemies foreign and domestic. When those two obligations conflict, I believe our primary responsibility is to the people we swore to protect." The military judge, a career officer with experience in both combat operations and military law, faced a decision that would set precedent for how the military handles situations where tactical effectiveness conflicted with political directives. The case had attracted attention from military leaders, legal scholars, and political officials who understood that the verdict would influence military operations for decades to come. In his final statement to court, Steele addressed not just the charges against his team, but the broader implications of their case. "We understand that we violated regulations and disobeyed direct orders. We accept responsibility for our actions and whatever consequences follow. But we do not regret preventing attacks that would have killed thousands of innocent Americans. If saving lives through disobedience is a crime, then we are guilty. But if protecting innocent people is our highest obligation as soldiers, then we did our duty." The verdict, delivered after 3 days of deliberation, reflected the complexity of the case and competing principles at stake. Steele and his team were found guilty of disobedience and unauthorized action, but the sentences were reduced to reflect the exceptional circumstances of their case and the strategic value of their mission's results. Steele was sentenced to dismissal from the service and 6 months of confinement, but with recognition that his actions had prevented attacks that would have caused mass casualties among civilian populations. His team members received similar sentences, ending their military careers but acknowledging that their violation of orders had served broader national security interests. The classified portions of the trial record, which detailed the specific intelligence secured by Viper Team and the attacks prevented by their unauthorized mission, would never be made public. But within the special operations community, their case became a reference point for discussions about the balance between obedience and effectiveness, between following orders and following principles that sometimes transcended regulatory requirements. 5 years after their court-martial, Steele and the members of Viper Team had rebuilt their lives and civilian careers that utilized their military skills while honoring their commitment to protecting innocent people from threats that conventional authorities couldn't address. Steele worked as a security consultant for organizations that operated in regions where terrorist threats required the kind of expertise that could only be developed through years of counterterrorism operations. Rodriguez established a training company that prepared civilian security personnel for work in high-threat environments, teaching skills that had been developed through special operations experience, but adapted for situations where legal authority was limited and political complications had to be avoided. Kim specialized in explosive ordnance disposal for humanitarian organizations that worked to clear minefields and unexploded ordnance from areas affected by conflict. Washington became an instructor at a law enforcement academy, training police snipers and SWAT teams in precision shooting techniques that had been refined through military operations but adapted for domestic law enforcement situations where collateral damage had to be absolutely minimized. The other members of Viper Team found similar careers that allowed them to continue contributing to security and counterterrorism efforts while operating within legal frameworks that provided political cover for actions that might not be officially authorized or acknowledged. They remained in contact with each other, not just as former teammates, but as people with shared experiences that created bonds stronger than career considerations or legal complications. They understood that their decision to disobey orders had ended their military careers, but had also prevented attacks that would have killed thousands of innocent people and changed the nature of American society in ways that would have required decades to recover from. The intelligence they had secured during their unauthorized mission continued to produce results years after their court-martial. Terrorist networks that had been disrupted by their actions never fully recovered their operational capabilities. Chemical and biological weapons that had been neutralized by their mission were never replaced or replicated by terrorist organizations that lacked the technical capabilities and logistical resources that had been eliminated with the destruction of Target Sigma 7. Most importantly, the attacks that had been planned against American civilian targets were never carried out. Elementary schools, shopping centers, water treatment facilities, and transportation hubs that had been targeted for mass casualty attacks continue to operate normally, their security enhanced by intelligence that had been secured through unauthorized actions that officially never happened. Steele never discussed their unauthorized mission publicly, understanding that acknowledgement would compromise ongoing counterterrorism operations and could endanger the lives of people who continue to work in environments where discovery meant death. But he also understood that some actions didn't require public recognition to be meaningful, and that the most important victories were often the ones that prevented tragedies rather than responding to them. In interviews with military historians who were studying the evolution of special operations, Steele emphasized that their case shouldn't be viewed as an example of justified disobedience, but as an illustration of the complexities that arose when tactical effectiveness conflicted with political considerations. We didn't disobey orders because we disagreed with policy. We disobeyed orders because we believed that preventing mass casualties was more important than following regulations. Whether that was right or wrong isn't for us to judge. That's for history to determine based on outcomes we'll never fully know. The official records of Viper Team's unauthorized mission remain classified at levels that ensured they would never be publicly released. But within the special operations community, their story became part of the informal education that prepared future operators for situations where perfect legal clarity might not exist and where mission success might require accepting personal consequences that exceeded any reasonable risk-to-benefit calculation. 10 years after Target Sigma 7, the world had changed in ways that made Steele's decision to disobey orders seem not just justified but prescient. The intelligence his team had secured had prevented attacks that would have killed tens of thousands of innocent civilians and had disrupted terrorist networks whose reconstitution would have required decades and resources that were no longer available after their leadership and infrastructure had been eliminated. The diplomatic initiatives that had motivated the original abort order had failed to produce the strategic benefits that policymakers had expected. Regional governments that were supposed to provide counterterrorism cooperation had instead continued to provide sanctuary and support for terrorist organizations, while negotiations that were supposed to create long-term stability had instead created opportunities for terrorist groups to rebuild their capabilities and plan new attacks. In contrast, the immediate tactical success achieved by Viper Team's unauthorized mission had produced strategic effects that continued to influence counterterrorism operations years after their court-martial. The elimination of Target Sigma 7's leadership had created power vacuums that terrorist organizations had never been able to fill effectively. The capture of intelligence materials had enabled follow-on operations that had disrupted terrorist networks across multiple continents. The neutralization of chemical and biological weapons had prevented their proliferation to other terrorist groups that lacked the technical capabilities to develop such weapons independently. Most importantly, the prevention of mass casualty attacks against civilian targets had preserved social stability and economic confidence that would have been severely damaged by successful terrorist operations. The elementary schools, shopping centers, and transportation hubs that had been targeted for attack continued to function normally, their security enhanced by intelligence that had been secured through actions that were never officially acknowledged or rewarded. Steele, now working as a consultant for international security organizations, occasionally encountered intelligence officials who thanked him privately for decisions that had prevented attacks and saved lives they couldn't publicly discuss. These conversations reminded him that some contributions to national security were measured not by official recognition, but by outcomes that made the world safer for people who would never know the risks that had been accepted on their behalf. His former teammates had similarly found ways to continue contributing to security and counterterrorism efforts while building civilian careers that honored their military experience without compromising ongoing operations. They remained connected not just by shared experiences, but by understanding that their unauthorized mission had achieved results that justified the personal costs they had accepted. The broader lessons of their case had been incorporated into military education programs that prepared future officers for situations where legal authority, tactical effectiveness, and moral obligations might conflict in ways that required personal judgment rather than regulatory compliance. Their story was taught not as an example of how to disobey orders, but as an illustration of the complexity that characterized modern military operations where political considerations and operational effectiveness sometimes produce conflicting requirements. Steele's final reflection on their unauthorized mission, shared with a military historian who was studying the evolution of special operations, captured both the satisfaction and the uncertainty that characterized their legacy. We saved lives that we'll never be able to count, prevented attacks that we'll never be able to describe, and disrupted operations that we'll never be able to discuss. Whether that was worth the cost to our careers is a question that others will have to answer. But I know that we did everything possible to protect innocent people from threats that conventional authorities couldn't address through normal procedures. The compound that had been Target Sigma 7 was never rebuilt or reoccupied. The valley where it had been located was eventually turned over to local control, but the area remained largely unpopulated due to its remote location and the lingering effects of the military operations that had eliminated its previous occupants. Occasionally, satellite imagery would show hikers or researchers passing through the area, but the ruins of the compound were gradually being reclaimed by the mountain environment that had once provided its security. For Steele and the members of Viper Team, the physical destruction of Target Sigma 7 was less important than the knowledge that their actions had prevented attacks, saved lives, and disrupted terrorist operations that would have caused suffering on scales that most people couldn't comprehend. Their unauthorized mission had ended their military careers, but it also achieved results that made their sacrifice meaningful in ways that official recognition could never equal. Some legends are celebrated with parades and monuments that honor publicly acknowledged achievements. Others are written in prevented tragedies, saved lives, and disrupted attacks that never happened because someone chose principle over procedure, effectiveness over obedience, and the protection of innocent people over preservation of their own careers and freedom. Captain Marcus Steele and Viper Team proved that when faced with the choice between following orders and preventing mass casualties, some soldiers will choose to disobey regulations in order to obey higher obligations that transcend military hierarchy. Their story reminds us that true heroism is often measured not by following rules, but by following principles that make rules necessary, and that the most important victories are sometimes achieved by people who accept personal defeat in order to prevent tragedies that would affect thousands of others who will never know their names or understand the risks that were accepted on their behalf.